Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to my post on ancient Egyptian paint, something that is extremely confusing to me. Did you ever wonder how the lacquer on ancient Egyptian coffins held up for 3,000 or even 5,000 years? Or how the paint in the murals kept its pigment and stayed stuck to the walls for over 4,500 years. I tried to find comparable examples, and what I found were Roman frescoes from Pompeii in 79 AD and tomb frescoes in Tuscany from 400 BC, and they had similarly faded pigment. I didn't find any Greek frescoes from before that, and I remember when I was on vacation in Greece, I once visited a location called Nestor's Palace. It was from 1200 BC, and the entire palace was nothing more than sand. So my puzzlement is over how on earth these 4,500-year-old murals look like they've just been painted yesterday, when 2,000-year-old murals are already so faded. I visited once the Pergamon Museum in Berlin and the British Museum in London, and they each had big displays of mummies and their coffins. Afterwards, I was very confused by the 3,000-year-old displays of wooden coffins covered in colorful paint, because everything gets faded with time, and 3,000 years is really a long time ago. As a child, I was taught that the dry desert air preserved the artifacts, but when I compared the ancient Egyptian caskets and artifacts I saw to ancient Greek caskets made out of stone in a similarly dry climate and with no paint and no mummified body left behind, my skepticism began to kick up. The ancient Greek stone caskets and artifacts were all worn down and sandy, and they didn't have a trace of paint on them after only 2,000 years. Yet the 3,300-year-old wooden caskets and statues from ancient Egypt looked like they were painted yesterday, and the 4,500-year-old murals were bright blue. I found that rather odd, since I couldn't find other examples of similarly colorful ancient paint. My archaeology knowledge starts and stops with Indiana Jones. But how did wood paint and skull and skin hold together for 3,300 years? The Tarim mummies in China are similar in age to the Egyptian ones, but I don't see any color or paint preserved in their burial sites. I've also been to Korea, and I saw their tombs, which are comparably old. They're built in these hills, and they didn't have any mummies. They had some artifacts, and the hills were still there, but they didn't have anything left over from the person. The ancient Egyptian burial sites would have had to be completely free of fungus or bacteria that eat wood, not to mention insects. So when I remember that the tombs were filled with food for the afterlife, and when I know that the tomb entrance flooded periodically, this was a desert environment, but it was right next to the Nile, and the Nile flooded that region over and over again every year. I did some research and I found a study of the rate of wood decay in desert riverine environments similar to that of Egypt. And I learned that the time required to reduce the volume of a regular piece of wood by half in a desert location protected from water is about 60 years. So the wood in the experiment lost volume primarily due to loss of moisture. Yet the wood in the Egyptian tombs didn't lose any volume over 3,300 years, and they were constructed of dowels stuck together with animal glue, a substance that has some water in it. The caskets, when you look at pictures of them, you find that they originally had some metal nails and rods for structural stability, but these metal pieces had been removed for some reason, perhaps for dating purposes, but nobody has them anymore. Nevertheless, the paint colors are still vibrant, and when I look at the academic research, I don't see any descriptions of chemical treatments to the wood to prevent dry rot. And today, I doubt you would find anyone who would know how to prevent dry rot in a piece of wood for 4,000 years. I mean, we have some nicely preserved tables from, the 1800s and such, but this is confusing. I found a picture of the present-day tomb of King Tut, and you see that the gold lacquer over his wooden and plaster encasement, it's absolutely pristine. And I'm baffled by how the plaster didn't crumble at all, because plaster would have water in it, and as time goes by, the water would go in, the water would go out, and that would cause the plaster to crumble, I would think. The Egyptians, and it wasn't like ceramic, this was plaster. The Egyptians would have had to have had a technology that was superior than what we can do today with plaster. So it's strange. It's also strange that when in 1920 these British explorers discovered a tomb, they concluded that it had been robbed twice, yet the robbers only took 60% of the jewelry. That's weird. How often do robbers leave jewelry behind? The story just doesn't add up. It seems like, it would be possible for an archaeologist or an explorer to come to Egypt and find some craftsmen and ask them to make some ancient-looking jewelry and then claim that he discovered it and take it back to Europe and sell it for a lot of money. But this would require mass delusion. That's silly. Surely, radiocarbon dating sorted this issue out decades ago, I would assume. But I did a little bit of digging there too, and I was rather disappointed. Radiocarbon analysis involves measuring the amount of the radioactive isotope carbon-14 in a deceased organic artifact and comparing it to the amount that was present when the organism died. To translate these measurements into calendar years, scientists originally established an equation based on the rate that carbon-14 decays. When the measured amount of carbon-14 from the sample is put into the equation, the result is a certain number of radiocarbon years before the present. And the word present has been defined as the year 1950. This equation worked on the presumption that the level of carbon-14 in the atmosphere is constant. But since years of climate studies, we know that this is not the case. So, to improve the translation guide, radiocarbon scientists have tested many objects of known age, usually trees, whose exact ages can be known through dendrochronology, counting the growth rings. By testing many objects with known ages, scientists are able to determine the levels of carbon-14 in the atmosphere and to see that they've fluctuated over the centuries. This allows them to create calibration curves that help them adjust the original results of their equation for better calendar accuracy. This process of establishing calibration curves is more of an art than a science. For mummies, like in Egypt, the radiocarbon dating is even further complicated by the bitumen used in embalming, or by the construction of fake artifacts in which the hair from one mummy was pasted onto another mummy's head, as happened in a group of French mummies recently. In the most recent radiocarbon dating of ancient Egyptian artifacts, from a scientific perspective, only samples of seeds were of any use. Bits of mummies or papyrus proved completely unreliable because of contamination with things like bitumen. And revisiting older studies of radiocarbon dating of all of these bits and pieces of Egyptian artifacts have been largely ruled out by newer studies, which reveal that researchers throughout the past decades had a tendency to only publish dates which agreed with their preconceived theories. So, for example, 2 carbon-14 dates of material from the tomb of Tutankhamun were never published by the British Museum, and they only reached the light of day when the laboratory released the results because the authorities would not. They were never published. They gave low dates of 846 BC that fitted better to a Palestinian account of history, much better than the Egyptian history. The experts wanted dates 450 years earlier. So it's not a very scientifically clear issue. At this point, it's entirely possible that the mummies could be fakes. If you give up on radiocarbon dating calibration issues and look further for scientific research into the preservation of ancient Egyptian wooden coffins covered in plaster and then coated with colorful paint, all I could find was a link to a story that advertised itself as an account of how the wooden and fabric artifacts from Egypt were preserved in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. However, I didn't find any science in the article. I only found this lament about the inferior and unprofessional manner in which the museum in Egypt maintained their artifacts, compared to the careful professionalism of the British Museum. Do I detect a note of imperialist cultural superiority? In any case, if I had a priceless 3,000 or 4,000 year old artwork, I wouldn't put it out in the open where anyone could blow it up. Yet, when I went into the British Museum, there was far less security than at an airport. This made me wonder if the museum pieces were reproductions. One speculation leads to another, and soon enough, I'm thinking up a crazy conspiracy theory. Suppose for a moment that the majority of the ancient Egyptian coffins and mummies are fakes for people who were just trying to make money, and that back in the 1920s, when the tomb of King Tut was discovered, ghost stories, seances, and ancient mysticism was very popular, and traveling circuses would display mummies, which were essentially just bodies they'd dug up to display in their freak shows. What if the explorers of Egypt, the ones who discovered these tombs, they found a bunch of dusty junk inside of this pyramid and decided to craft something more interesting to bring back home? And that when these museums are working hard to preserve these artifacts, which are rusting in many cases, they're working hard to preserve some junk that was manufactured back in the 1920s with poor quality materials, and it's falling apart. Not because it's 4,000 years old. This is kind of silly, of course. I don't usually believe in conspiracy theories, especially conspiracies that would date back to the 1920s. I mean, maintaining fake 3,000-year-old mummies for 100 years would take an amazing amount of secrecy and gullibility. Still, I wonder what other sorts of conspiracy theories are circulating. Is mine the craziest of them all, or are there even crazier ones? This led me to the Great Mud Flood Conspiracy, which is a doozy. The Mud Flood Conspiracy is the idea that there was a gigantic flood of mud that swept across the entire planet as recently as the 1800s. And this ended what had been a great Russian empire called Tartaria that spanned the entire globe. The primary evidence to support this conspiracy theory is the fact that old buildings have basements that sometimes appear to be decorated as though they might have once served as the first floor of the building. Okay. According to the mud flood theorists, Egyptian mummies were invented to cover up the true purpose of the pyramids: survival shelters and food storage for kings. Now, I'm not on board with the whole mud flood thing for many reasons, but mainly because it sounds like a Russian nationalist propaganda effort to create a foundation myth in which Russians were the original natural rulers of the world. So what I know from watching YouTube videos is that KGB types are very skilled at subverting cultural narratives, and this seems like something they might just do for fun. Let's just see if we can convince people across the world via YouTube that they're really Russians. Like people in Argentina, people in South Carolina, people in everywhere. Let's see if we can convince them that they're actually Russian. And their governments have been lying to them about history. I mean, people are really gullible. So I would have to say this is an absolutely diabolically clever propaganda effort. But it's absolutely tragic that it has a chance of convincing a significant number of people of such things. Subversion works, and foundation myths are very important. You know, all those stories we are told about how our country was formed are important. And when a group is trying to subvert those foundation myths, they will teach your children that right is left and left is right. And then your kids won't trust anyone or anything. They certainly don't trust their government. I mean, I think this has already happened to a large extent. I mean, I see evidence of it all over the place. Fake news. I live in Germany, and I've found that Germans are rather resistant to subversion because they have a strong memory of recent history. You know, mass murder happened right here not long ago. But Americans these days are wobbly on history, politics, and religion. They've got conspiracies on the right and on the left threatening to take down the center. So all I can say is, please get it together, guys. You need your foundation myths. You need your history. You need to teach your kids so that they aren't influenced by YouTube videos about Tartaria. For goodness sakes. I honestly think that older religious traditions are the only institutions strong enough to resist this sort of subversion that threatens U.S. identity and unity. So I'm making this video using the example of ancient Egypt to make a point about the present and how easy it is to completely fool people about fundamental things. So back to ancient Egypt and Great Britain. Foundation myths are powerful, and we should question how our modern power structures influence the stories we tell about the cradles of civilization. I was struck by how the article about artifact preservation focused on the ineptitude of the Egyptian Museum compared to the British Museum, while spending no time on the science of artifact preservation. There is an ugly narrative of cultural superiority mixed in there. And who knows if there was an advanced Black African civilization hiding underneath the Sahara, which predates all of the civilizations to which we trace the European foundation myths. And let's be honest, European foundation myths, up until very recently, were basically just white supremacy myths. This idea that the ancient Greeks were white, the Egyptians were white, and they were the first civilizations, and so on. I was taught that these myths warped history and that the ancients had very different attitudes towards race compared to those who later studied those cultures. So there was a famous book called Before Color Prejudice that everybody was very tribal in their attitudes about who's from where you come from, but they weren't very hung up on skin color and ideas that different groups of people were better or worse based on the color of their skin. So this leads me to my final conspiracy theory. Why are so many old statues missing their noses? I know that in some cases it was an Islamic issue that you didn't want to have graven images or early Christian issues. But another a question this relates to is how many of those people were removing noses because they were African noses? How many old statues are whitewashed fakes? What if the nose on the Sphinx was removed because it was an African nose? Okay, that's enough. I don't want to be subverting good foundation myths. I want us to question the bad foundation myths. We need a renewal of foundations, but not a complete subversion of foundations. So we need critical thinking to filter some nonsense out, but not completely replace the nonsense we have now with new nonsense about something like Tartaria. So thank you for watching this train of thought, and I hope it gave you something to think about or research yourself. My second novel, My Orwellian Odyssey, explores why we look back at history and how we distort narratives to serve our purposes. It's a whimsical, kind of funny book, and if you like dark humor and to think about, well, I have a strange sense of humor, so take a look, it might be your thing. Until next time, thank you for watching.